Thank you so much for the great invitation, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for introduction, and thank you for the invitation to visit. It's been really wonderful meeting with students and faculty here. This is not a community that I've really gotten the chance to interact with much before, so it's really nice to learn about what's going on here and all the cool science that you all are doing. So before I get going, half the time I always forget to acknowledge my co-authors. So this is very much a collaborative project. Most of the stuff I'll be telling you today is a NOAA project where we've been looking at model biases. And so my co-PI in that is Steve Yeager at NCAR, and he's very much been an equal share like PI on this. A lot of the data you're going to see is stuff that he processed so that I could then go and do the actual fun data analysis. But there was a lot of really involved data engineering to get the data into a form that we could actually analyze. And he's just, one of my favorite collaborators to work with in general. And there's a bunch of junior scientists who have worked on this too. At NCAR, Brendan Myers, I'll see some of his figures, Feng Zhu and Tegan King, who are both software engineers who have helped us get our workflow in such a place that we can do some analysis on these very large data sets in an easy way. And also Tadra Loza, grad student working in my group. She's working more on the water mass transformation part of this project. You won't see as much in it, but she's been a part of these conversations. So the tool that I use for a lot of my work is global climate models. So global climate models, these are the kind of things that you use in Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. So for example, these are really essential tools for, I think, two classes of problems. If you want to predict future climate for the whole globe, as used in IPCC reports, this is the kind of Earth system model or global climate model that you really need for that. The other realm that I see global climate models being particularly useful for is investigating theories for how the Earth system works in a global context or in a very large context. So much like a bunch of the other type of models that folks here are running, these work by you chop up the globe into a bunch of little boxes, and then you apply the laws of physics and thermodynamics in each of those boxes. The boxes talk to each other as air or water is infected, and then the stuff that goes on at a smaller scale than those boxes has to be parameterized somehow. Clouds, mesoscale eddies, radiation, all of those have to be incorporated somehow in here. Global climate models are great tools, but all models are wrong. Some are useful. And so this is a major point of thing that my group works on is where are these climate models going wrong? How do they compare to observations? We must always ground our models in what's actually happening, because this gives us a sense of whether the models are fit to purpose and whether or not. So global climate models, they have issues. There's a lot of things to get right. But what we try to figure out is what aren't they getting right and what can we learn from them to improve them in the future? And so this is actually a big task of NOAA's Model Diagnostics Task Force, a group with which I'm on the lead team for, and we put together a software package trying to diagnose what's going wrong in climate models in a lot of ways. So global climate models, they make it most commonly, they're most commonly heard about outside of our community as part of projects like the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. So every 7 or 8 years, all the climate modeling centers in the world get together and agree that they're going to run the same simulations following the same protocols for all of the models as best they can. They are required to run, to be part of the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project and get your stuff into the IPCC reports. You have to agree to run a minimum number of experiments that they call the DEC experiments. So a pre-industrial control out to at least 500 years, a simulation of historical climate, 1% CO2 each year increasing, and then an abrupt 4 times CO2. So that's what's expected. But CMIP, as many of you probably know, is much, much larger than just those 4 experiments. There are like a whole host of other MIPs that modeling centers can opt into and produce simulations for. And there's a lot, and anytime you have multiple models contributing to one of these model and comparison projects, it presents the opportunity for a lot of model comparison that can point to ways that some models are getting things right, some of them are getting wrong, and maybe where other models can be improved. So I put an arrow right here towards the MIP from which I'm going to be using most of the data today, the Ocean Model and Comparison Project. It's just one part of CMIP out of a whole big ecosystem of stuff. So what's the problem that I've been looking into is what's going wrong in the North Atlantic. So let's take a dive back through history, back to the very first CMIP, so in the 90s. So here on the left-hand panel, this is SST bias. So what the models all say, averaged together, minus observation of time mean sea surface temperature. This is the first couple modern comparison project. Here's the second. These are taken from Reckler and Kim. And you should probably say to them, like, oh yeah, I see some issues in the Gulf Stream, the Kuroshio, a little bit in the tropical Pacific, but that's not really looking too bad. Well, yes, but that's because CMIP1 and CMIP2 models were flux corrected. So what they did was they put surface heat fluxes at the ocean to constrain the climate to where you want to be. So you're kind of holding the ocean and the atmosphere fixed to where you want. It wasn't until CMIP3 that most of the models took that scaffold off to see what a truly fully coupled interacting climate system would do. And that's what CMIP3 looked like. And so the problem that I've been working on here is this big blue bias up in the North Atlantic that was very colorfully coined the blue spot of death by the GFDL folks. You can find that in this nice paper by Donna Deskin et al., which is actually about parameterizations, but they have this term in there. So this is a blue spot of death. Anytime it shows up, you're going to have issues. So CMIP3 was back when I was starting grad school, and we've had two more CMIPs since, CMIP5 and CMIP6. You got to be thinking, okay, in the last 15 years, we have to have made progress on these biases, right? Not really. Here's CMIP5 and CMIP6. The blue spot of death is still present in both of them. Southern Ocean still looks pretty biased too. So that's the problem. What is this bias? Is there what can we do to improve it? But we should also first ask the question, does this matter? Is this going to impact our larger climate model simulation in a way that's going to make it worse for other folks who want to do climate impacts research? And the answer is yes. So what I've got here is a couple of figures from a paper by Keeley et al. In 2012. These are atmosphere-only simulations where they're forcing the atmosphere with two different sea surface temperature fields. The first is the sea surface temperature field from observations. The second is sea surface temperature observations plus what climate models typically get biased. And then these two figures are the differences of sea surface temperature on the left and mean sea level pressure on the right. So sea surface temperature on the left, this is that, big bias pattern. So it makes sense that if you're forcing the atmosphere with this actual SST, its difference better be the SST you're getting in there, which is that bias. And then this is the atmospheric response to that bias. And you got this big high pressure here and a low pressure there of up to magnitude 4 hectopascals. 4 hectopascals is pretty big. So if we're thinking of the primary mode of variability in the North Atlantic, so the North Atlantic Oscillation, its variability, its pattern, it has maxima of roughly 4 hectopascals in its centers of action. So what this bias is on the same order of magnitude as the main mode of variability. So that's a problem. So what this is saying here, you've got this big high pressure and this low pressure. This is giving you the jet in the wrong place. It's giving you advection around Europe in the wrong place. It is going to degrade the climate simulation, particularly over a big population center in Europe. So it really is important that we try to get to the bottom of this climate bias as best we can. So today I'm going to tell you about two projects. Mostly I'm going to spend time on the first that are related to biases in the North Atlantic. So the first I'll spend the most time on is thinking about these upper ocean biases, what they look like in the Ocean Model Comparison Project, and how they relate to the AMOC. We have good observations of stuff at the surface. We have much less in the AMOC. So the hope is that if you understand how the biases work in the upper ocean, maybe you can infer a little bit about the AMOC too. And then if I have time, I'm going to talk about another project, which is kind of related to biases, but it was a little surprise that came along, something else that might be contributing to model biases from a very unusual place. So let's orient ourselves in the North Atlantic. So here's the horizontal circulation. The red arrows on top are the upper ocean circulation. The blue is the deep circulation. So you got the subtropical gyre, the subpolar gyre here. I think a few key features for this talk to think about are the Gulf Stream, and in particular where it detaches. If it detaches in the wrong place, you're going to get biases, but also the North Atlantic Current, which has some very distinct meanders that are really important for setting things up. So we've got this, it goes off this way, and then we have this turn northward in the northwest corner region, and then another turn back as it goes across the Mid-Atlantic Ridge through places like the Charlie Gibbs Fracture Zone. So those meanders are super important in getting the sea surface temperature field correct. So we've got these biases in the climate models, and I'm here to tell you that these are coming from the ocean models. It's not a coupling feature between ocean and atmosphere or ocean and ice. These show up in ocean-only simulations. And so this is the paper introducing the most recent OMIP intercomparison by Shuzino et al. On the top, we have OMIP1 on the left, sea surface temperature on the top, and sea surface bias on the bottom. And so you can see, even in these ocean-only simulations, you have this big area of blue bias. And the reason they are there is because this class of models, these global ocean models, they just don't get the pathway of the North Atlantic Current and the Gulf Stream correct. So why is the North Atlantic Current missing those key meanders in these global climate simulations? So what I've got here is just sort of a schematic of what this looks like. So in the contours, that is the temperature field from climatological, from a grid analysis called EN4. So think of that as the stand-in for observations. And then the shading is the bias. So the first reason, so you can imagine that if you're taking the observations and imagining where in the model you've got the contour is tight for the North Atlantic Current, they're going to be pushed over to the right. So the first reason why your Gulf Stream's in the wrong place is because you've got biases in the wrong place. Your sea surface temperature's in the wrong place. And I've just kind of taken you in a big chicken and the egg question, right? I said the reason why you have biases is because the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Current are in the wrong place. And I said, well, the reason you've got the North Atlantic Current in the wrong place is because you've got the Gulf, their biases are there. These things are, you can use geostrophic dynamics like thermal wind to explain that these two things must be locked together. So this presents the possibility for a lot of, positive feedbacks between sea surface temperature field and Gulf Stream getting it right. So the common thing that most people talk about when trying to think about this problem is saying, well, we must be missing some subgrid scale processes, something that's happening far below the 1 degree that's very common in this class of model, like mesoscale eddies. And so let's take a look at what these actually look like. So on top, I've got a ocean model simulation that uses 1 degree. So this is a very typical CMAP class model. And the bottom, this is an eddy resolving model where the horizontal resolution is 0.1 degrees. And you see just it's very different, right? Up here, the Gulf Stream and North Atlantic Current are very diffuse. They're very weak. You don't get the meanders. Down here, you actually see something that resembles the ocean. You see eddies. You see all sorts of meanders. You see places where the gradient is tight. It's a much more realistic simulation. Though you'll also notice still, you don't have that northward bend, even in this 0.1 degree simulation. And I'd like to quickly acknowledge Rudra Thacker, a student in my group, who when I called him up and said, hey, do you have a nice schematic of high res versus low res? He sent this. So thank you, Rudra. He's very awesome. So that kind of, you see in the high res simulation I just showed you, has that nice eddies and meanders, but it still doesn't get those turns in the right spot. And so folks have been looking at, if you have, comparing high res and low res models, does it improve things in this region? And the answer is yes and no, depends on the model. So this is a study by Chassagnier et al. On the bottom, we have the low res counterpart and the high res counterpart. And you can see in some models, the biases improve when you go to high res, and in some, there's not much improvement. So resolution may or may not actually be the solution to the problem. Another possibility is that these kind of eddy resolving 10th degree simulations not sufficient. Maybe we need to get even higher down to 1/20th degree. And here's an example from the group in Germany and Geomar, where they have a 1/20th degree ocean only simulation. The Gulf Stream path, North Atlantic Current path, just see that where the high variance is. Here's observations, here's their 1/20th degree, and here's a 1/4 degree. And you can see the comparison between satellite altimetry and the Gulf Stream path in their 1/20th degree model looks a lot better. Unfortunately, we're not going to be in a place to run these types of simulations fully coupled to an atmosphere for model and comparison projects like CMIP anytime soon. So it's incumbent upon us to really try to understand what's going on in the models that we need for the problems we have at this global climate scale for the time being. But, maybe 30 years from now, or even sooner, depending on how GPUs really speed up our science, maybe we'll be closer to that, being able to run that on a fully coupled mode sooner than we like. So here's what I'm going to add to this, what's been talked about already. So how do we understand the relationship in this upper ocean field to what's going on with AMOC in the OMIP simulations? So first, I'm going to just demonstrate what the temperature and salinity biases still exist. Then we're going to do a regression of up the ocean fields like temperature and salinity against the North Atlantic current region itself to try to understand, okay, if you're holding fixed what's going on here, how does the rest of the North Atlantic vary around it? Then I'll talk about AMOC and density coordinates, and then we'll combine AMOC with those upper ocean panels to understand how those patterns covary together to possibly say, okay, well, if your upper ocean is biased in this way, what is the AMOC doing? And then finally, I'm going to propose, and this is, some newer stuff, where did the biases come from in the first place? And so that's something we can use these OMIP simulations to perhaps answer. So I've been talking about OMIP kind of obliquely. Let's actually define what these simulations are. I'm using the interannual forcing simulations. And so we have two different ocean sea ice only simulations. The way you take it is you take a best guess at the atmospheric state. So winds, temperature of the atmosphere, specific humidity of the surface, and from two data sets, from NCEP's reanalysis, the core data set, and from the JRA 55 driving ocean data set. Use those at the atmosphere, at the surface, drive your ocean model from, in the core case, 1948 to 2009, with our best guess of what happened. And then you repeat, you go that 5 times. You go from 1948 to 2009, and then back 5 times to give the ocean model an attempt at spinning up. And then you do the same thing with JRA 55. So this is OMIP 1 and OMIP 2. And if you're more interested in more of this protocol, Steve Griffey's has the paper on the protocol, and Sugino has the initial results from these models. So this is the bias in OMIP 1 and OMIP 2 for upper ocean temperature. So I'm taking the average in the upper 200 meters, and I'll be using upper 200 meters for most of the rest of this talk. So contours are the observational field, in this case from EN4, and shading shows the deviation from that observational field, in this case in the OMIP multi-model mean and in the OMIP 2 multi-model mean. So if you're too cold here, you can imagine that the contours, the isotherms are getting pushed over that away. You can see there's very little difference between OMIP 1 and OMIP 2. There are different sets of models that contribute to each of these, but there's really no difference between the forcing data sets. So even though you have these different representations of the atmosphere, that really doesn't make a big impact. I'll just show you briefly that, you can do this for each of the models you have. There's all the open OMIP 1, the very last cycle. And you can kind of glance on and do like a little mental image of like how much there is varying in this cold spot region. Some aren't as bad, some are more intense. Similar with OMIP 2. Some aren't as bad, some are more intense. This one has more of a warm bias, but for the most part, they all kind of have this issue. So I have been describing this whole problem in terms of cold bias, but it's not just a cold bias, it's a fresh bias too. So in the subpolar North Atlantic, you tend to have cold and fresh anomalies going together because of their place of origin. And in the subtropics, you tend to have warm and salty. So if you're displacing where the North Atlantic current is and you're pushing it further, south and over a bit, you're going to get a fresh anomaly from the subpolar region along with it. So on top, we've got the temperature biases again, and now bottom, we have the salinity biases. So you can see a fresh bias in the same place, you have a temperature bias. I should also note there's biases in the Gulf Stream region because of Gulf Stream detachment is still an issue also. And so in the Gulf Stream region, it's a little bit too warm and salty because they're detaching too far north. And then to prove that these things really go together. So each of these dots is one cycle from one of the OMIP 1 or OMIP 2 simulation. On the x-axis is salinity bias. 0, 0 is where you have no bias. On the y-axis is temperature. And you can see a really, really clear relationship. And this is in that North Atlantic current region. So if you understand what's going on with the temperature bias, chances are it's going along with fresh bias as well. And just to sort of look at, just scanning through all of the fresh biases as well, you can see it tends to be a little bit more diffuse. It's not as bullseye in the North Atlantic current region quite. But here's somebody who's doing something quite different. Similar bias pattern for the most part. Here's OMIP 2 again. There's differences, but in general, you see this like blue bullseye in most of the simulations with differing variability. Okay, this is not particularly new. Sugino et al. Showed this for OMIP 1 and OMIP 2. For the previous iteration, Donabasholu et al. 2014-ish or 2016-ish showed this as well. Not new. What is new is we're going to try and take what we understand from these biases and apply it to different regressions, to different data sets, to try to understand how this is connected to other things. So next, I've got some work from an assistant scientist at NCAR, Brendan Myers. So what we're doing in this section is we are taking regressions of whatever field we have against the average of temperature in the North Atlantic current box, so in this green box. So what I've got here is a regression of upper ocean temperature against the temperature in that box. So wherever it is red, that implies that when temperatures are high in the North Atlantic current box, temperatures are also high in this region. Where it's blue, it says when temperatures are high in the North Atlantic current box, it is anomalously cold here. Or vice versa. If, like in this region, this is where you have that bias, this is saying if a model is anomalously cold here, then these are also other regions where it should be anomalously cold. So red means to that location's temperature goes together with the bias in the North Atlantic current region. And then the opposite means that they anomalously go against each other. So it makes sense that if we're taking a regression against this box, that box should have really high correlation and be, a high correlation of a positive number. So temperature. So we see that when you have positive anomalies here, you tend to have a negative anomaly there when you have a cold bias here. So we can do the same thing for salinity, but regressed against the temperature in this box of interest. So what this is showing us is that when you have a really warm anomaly here in this box, this whole region tends to be anomalously salty. That makes sense, right? Warm and salty anomalies tend to go together, cold and fresh anomalies tend to go together. So if we have a model that has a greater cold bias than others, chances are it's also going to have a greater fresh subpolar North Atlantic. So as you all are probably aware, what's really important for the circulation field is not temperature or salinity on its own, but density through the equation of state. So this is the upper 200 meter average sigma 0 field against, again, regression of temperature bias in this location. So where you've got high temperature, this is saying you've got anomalously low density. So that's interesting, right? So if you have high temperature, low density, that means its temperature is what's setting the density anomaly. Over here, this is saying if you have high temperature in the North Atlantic current box, you've got high density. That doesn't make sense if temperature is the only thing setting the density anomaly, right? That means that this has got to be driven by the salinity part. So this field is kind of different from what we had in temperature. It'll keep going. Temperature, come back, temperature and salinity. It's the combination of the both. And because the equation of state is nonlinear, particularly where it gets really cold, that means that, the salinity anomaly is going to be winning against the temperature anomaly in different ways, particularly in the Labrador Sea. So now that we have the density anomaly in the anomalous density in this region, we can kind of infer via thermal wind what the circulation associated with a cold bias is. So this is sort of telling you that if you've got a cold bias in this region in the North Atlantic current, this is associated with an anomalous circulation kind of in that direction. So that kind of really follows the outlines of the subpolar gyre, doesn't it? You go around the Reykjanes Ridge a little bit right there, up towards Greenland, then around the Labrador Sea and back down. So this is really kind of showing that the biases you're setting up are having an impact on the subpolar gyre circulation. If you have a cold bias in this region, you're going to get a strengthened subpolar gyre via thermal wind, because this is the really cold part. Okay, so cold bias, probably that model also is going to have, if you have a colder bias in a model, more likely than not, that model is also going to have a strong subpolar gyre. So let's switch gears a little bit. We'll come back to these patterns and how they're related in a second, but let's talk about the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation and how it's related to those upper ocean fields. Okay, so I have been calculating AMOC in sigma 2 coordinates. And the reason why we've been doing it is that so that we can, so the Tadra Lowe is a student in my group. She's doing her thesis primarily on water mass transformation and what we can learn about ocean model biases from that. And you can compare estimates of water mass transformation directly to meridional overturning circulation, and then sort of piece out if you see a bias in water mass transformation, which you can calculate a lot easier than a bias in AMOC, you can infer a little bit about maybe what's going on with AMOC in your model. So let's orient ourselves with AMOC and sigma coordinates. We have sigma 2 on the y-axis, latitude on the x. So red means you're going clockwise. So this is different. Climate scientists often use AMOC and z coordinates, where it's just kind of like a nice little oval. And then you throw this one up and no one knows what to do with it. But y'all are oceanographers, probably not as big an issue here. So here's the subtropical gyres going this way. And then what's happening is you're getting water densifying at the surface as you go from the subtropics all the way down. So you're going down in density, but that's the highest circulation you have. So for example, here's the Gulf Stream. That's this circulation kind of in this area. And then the deep western boundary current is where you've got the strong gradients in the bottom. So the deep western boundary current is this blue arrow down here. So basically you've taken the 3-dimensional circulation, collapsed it into 2 dimensions. And then the most common thing you do as a climate scientist is then take the maximum at some latitude and say that is your AMOC, and you boil it down to 1 metric. This is useful when you're trying to do some sort of analysis with a lot of data with multiple models. Is it a good thing to do? I mean, we've taken this very complicated picture of what's going on and boiled it down potentially just 1 number. The AMOC is pretty complicated. So I would say, be careful when you're doing this kind of thing and recognize all of the many processes that are going on when you boil it down to 1 number. And don't forget about those because they matter. Okay, so here's something finally that I'm pretty sure hasn't been done before. Here is AMOC and sigma coordinates for OMIP1. So I've got the multi-model mean here, which looks like what I just showed you, as well as for each of the individual models. And if you just stare at those, and do like a brain in your head, you'll see, hey, some of those have really dark maximum stream function, like down here, meaning that it's a really strong AMOC. Some of them are, much weaker. This is not all the OMIP models because it actually is a really, this is an intense thing to do to get this calculation right from CMIP output, because CMIP output does not come in necessarily a good format. So in a climate model or an ocean model, you have different grids, right? And where the velocity is different from where temperature is. And so you need to keep track of the grid metrics. Where are the corners? Where are the fluxes coming in? And sometimes the models, the way they get saved and then distributed to the community, those details get lost. So backing out, so something I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years is figuring out how to back out what the grid was based on the information that I got from these data sets. So I'm very proud of the 12 models I do have, and that this does, for the most part, close reasonably without having to remove any kind of residual. That's why there's only 12. There's a few that it doesn't work for, and we've thrown those out for the time being until we can figure it out. So here's OMIP 1. Here's OMIP 2. Similarly, also a lot of variability from model to model. So going forward, I'm going to combine OMIP 1 and OMIP 2 together so that I have a bit larger of a sample size. You could argue that maybe that's not the best thing because there's a couple of models that contributed to both OMIP 1 and OMIP 2, but make do with what the data you have. Okay, can I have a show of hands? Who's familiar with empirical orthogonal functions, or PCA, principal component analysis? Cool, so like 2/3 of the room, awesome. So for those of you who are not, I'll briefly explain it. So EOF, or PCA, is a method for trying to pull out the patterns that explain the most variability. And in climate data sets, this is how you get all of your favorite climate modes of, the North Atlantic. So the North Atlantic Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. You use your data sets to pull out the pattern. So how you do this is you take your original time series that has some length, and then you have, some number of samples, and you use linear algebra to pull apart EOFs, which go in this matrix, the spatial patterns. That's what you want. And then you get in climate speak, typically the principal components are the time series that go along with each of those weights. So like at any given time, how much is that pattern expressed? And then these are the singular values, which tell you something about the variance explained. So these are typically ordered by patterns that explain the most variance. So the first pattern explains the most variance in your data set. The second explains the second most, et cetera, et cetera. EOFs are orthogonal to each other. Principal components are orthogonal to each other. Great. Here's a visual representation of this. If this is daily maps of sea level pressure or SST, imagine anything, you can, this data set multiplied by your pattern, so this is the pattern that explains the most variability, X North Atlantic Oscillation, you multiply those to each other by each other and you get a time series for how much the actual atmosphere or ocean looks like your pattern. This is a very classic thing to do in climate science. I'm doing something a little different here. Instead of using an EOF analysis with respect to time, I'm changing the dimension to model. And I'm lining up all of the models as the data set to try to understand what does the cross model variability look like. Instead I have an EOF that explains the patterns of variability from one model to the next. So here's the fun thing you can do now that we've got this data set built up, now that we can calculate AMOC and sigma coordinates, we can take a look at what it looks like across the OMIP space. So this is the first EOF of AMOC and sigma coordinates. The contours are the multi-model mean of both OMIP1 and OMIP2, and the shading is the EOF. So and this EOF, by the way, explains 75% of the variance, and that is a large amount of the variance. So this is like what is going on from one model to the next. This is most of it. So where we have red, that's implying that the stream function is increasing. And where we have blue, it's where it's decreasing. So what you see here is you've got all this red in the area of maximum stream function. This indicates that you're getting a stronger, the greatest mode of variability is a strengthening of the AMOC that occurs where you also have the deep western boundary current. So this, the tight gradient down here, that occurs at denser classes of water. And then you also have this shift over in this region down to denser classes. So this is where the North Atlantic current is. And so you've got blue here, meaning that those isopycnal stream functions are getting pushed down. And then you also then shifted to denser classes. So this is the cool thing, right? When you have a model with a strong AMOC, it's going to have a deep western boundary current that's denser. Okay, let's take another show of hands. How many of you are familiar with maximum covariance analysis? Okay, maximum covariance, I teach climate data analysis, so MCA is a fun one. Basically what you do with MCA is the same kind of linear algebra where you're pulling things apart, but this time you're, instead of taking, pulling apart modes for the variance, you're pulling apart the modes based on the covariability of two patterns. So in this time, what I'm doing is I'm taking the covariability of each model's AMOC pattern against the covariability of all of each model's temperature bias or temperature pattern. That's step one. Step two is then you do another SVD analysis and you pull out, instead of having EOFs and PCs, you end up with AMOC patterns that are paired with a temperature pattern. So you have these paired patterns of the two fields you're interested in that explain the most covariability. And that's, yeah, I get a paired temperature pattern and a paired AMOC pattern that go together we can look at. So here we're applying maximum covariance analysis of AMOC with upper ocean temperature. We typically call them the left mode and the right mode, just depending on which you stick in the covariability on the left or right. You could switch them around, no big deal. Okay, so these are the two patterns we get when we do this across all of OMIP space. So what we see is that this time we've got a pattern that's just pretty much blue everywhere, but now you have a dipole going the other direction. And so what this is saying is that when you've got a weaker AMOC with a deep western boundary current that's on lighter classes, you also tend to have a cold anomaly throughout much of the subpolar North Atlantic, including in where the North Atlantic current should be. So models with a cold current tend to have a weaker AMOC and a lighter deep western boundary current. And this is just a reminder of, what this, so this is not the bias. This is the variability of the temperature patterns in model space. This one over here is the bias. They're in the same, very similar locations, but they have subtle differences. For example, this pattern of variability, extends out to the Labrador Sea and further north. but it does overlap with that region of maximum bias. And so what this is saying is that you can imagine, one model compared to the next is this pattern added on to that one, or vice versa. You have a range of biases in model space. So AMOC, here's this EOF I showed you earlier, and here's this AMOC mode that came out of this paired analysis. And really, they're just the same thing, but multiplied by -1. When you do linear algebra, sometimes just the linear algebra works out. The algorithm just spits you out the same thing, but multiplied by -1. This is the same dynamics. So what this tells you is this thing that explained most of the variability across models is pretty much the same thing as what's going on with the cold blob. So this cross-model bias that has this cold anomaly associated with is also explaining the variability of the AMOC across model space. So it's related to if the AMOC is stronger or weaker and where its deep western boundary current falls in sigma 2 space. So I'm going to go through this a little quicker. You do the same thing. You can do the same thing with salinity. So this AMOC pattern that we're starting to see across sigma space is associated with, in general, a subpolar gyre region that's really, really fresh. So weaker AMOC associated with a fresh subpolar North Atlantic. That kind of makes sense, right? If it's fresh, densities tend to be lighter. If it's lighter, maybe you've increased the stratification, and so AMOC should be weaker. That, you can make arguments with that without too much effort. But really, it's density that matters for stratification. It's not temperature salinity on its own. So here was the cool thing I did that I wasn't expecting. I combined, now this is doing the same analysis, but with upper 200 meter sigma 0. And I get an MCA pattern that looks still identical to the ones we've had before. But this is the pattern of density that pops out. And this is very much similar to that pattern we saw from the regression of cold bias in this region. And so what you see is that you have anomalously dense water just south of Greenland, anomalously fresh water around the periphery of the subpolar gyre. And this is associated with a weaker AMOC. And you can combine the biases you have from temperature or salinity to understand those features. So the temperature bias is really big in the center of the subpolar gyre. And when you have really cold anomalies, this should give you denser. And so that's what's winning in the middle. But everywhere else across the rest of the North Atlantic, subpolar North Atlantic, the fresh bias is winning. So the fresh bias is overcoming any temperature in the Labrador Sea. And you only have these fresh biases in the eastern North Atlantic. So you don't have the same thing. And again, if you've got a density nom like this, you can kind of associate with thermal wind that this is the kind of circulation that is implied by this pattern of density. Again, you see that when you have a cold blob here, still surrounded by fresh, this gives you something that looks like the subpolar gyre should be strengthening. So our upper ocean density pattern that's associated with a relatively weak AMOC also is associated with a relatively strong subpolar gyre. Then one last of these before we start to talk about what it means. So this is the same analysis where you're doing these paired patterns, but with mixed layer depth. When you have anomalously weak AMOC, you also have anomalously shallow mixed layer depths, especially in the Labrador Sea. And that makes sense, right? If models in particular, models have issues with stuff going on in the Labrador Sea. Often there's too much. But this is saying that if you change up the mixed layer depths, presumably mixing or deep water formation in the Labrador Sea, has a big impact on what's going on in AMOC in a model. So one interpretation of all these results so far is let's say you've got a model with a biased North Atlantic that's cold in the North Atlantic current region and fresh around it, kind of like what we got in all these climate models. One way you could, and you also have a stronger subpolar gyre as a result of that density pattern. If you have a stronger subpolar gyre, particularly in this northern part, you are going to advect more fresh cold water from this side of Greenland and around into the Labrador Sea. And if you have more fresh water, perhaps you're going to cap things off and you're going to make it harder for mixing, and your mixed layer depths could shallow. And if you have shallower mixed layer depths, maybe you're not getting the deep water formation, or you'd have less of that dense class that's formed, and you get a weaker AMOC with a deep western boundary current at lighter classes. So that looks like a really nice story until I tell you, well, you know, these are positive feedbacks, right? Once you've advected fresh water into the Labrador Sea or your subpolar gyre is increased, you're going to advect more fresh and cold water into the central subpolar gyre. And it's just a big, it's just a big positive feedback potentially that these things are self-reinforcing. So it's really hard to tell what came first. Was it the mixed layer depths? Was it, the temperature anomaly got perturbed first? Was it something with sea ice? So this is all self-consistent, makes sense, but it doesn't actually help explain what might be triggering this. So the nice thing about the OMIP simulations is that we've got those 5 cycles I told you about, where you start from an observations-based initial condition, and then you let them all the different models spin up in their own way. So you can take a look at that first cycle and then see how these biases develop. And so this is all fresh results from the last week. So I'm still thinking about this. So interpretations may yet vary, but something really cool. These biases start developing within the first year. This is really fast. This does not take, multiple cycles. This is within, even in some cases, the first couple of months. So here's OMIP mean temperature and OMIP mean salinity, year 1, year 2, year 3. And you can see a hint of the cold anomaly right there. And there's that fresh anomaly, and then they only strengthen over time. So now I'm trying to figure out, how do I figure out models that are doing this really badly versus models that are doing this a little less badly, because they all have this bias. How do those differ? So what I've done is I've taken the 5 OMIP models that have the worst biases, and these are in these columns, and then the 5 models that in the North Atlantic Current have the least worst biases. A few of them are okay, but most of them still have this issue. And so I've averaged those together on the left-hand side and averaged on the right-hand side. This is upper ocean temperature. And so year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And then I've subtracted out the ensemble mean. So how do these 2 classes of, really bad and maybe a little less bad compare? And so you can see first year 1, these 2 groups, mostly for the most part similar. By year 2, you're starting to see some differences in the Labrador Sea that amplify by year 3. By year 10, you're seeing that you have these models are extra cold compared to these ones that are maybe not as bad. And then by the time you get out to the end of this first cycle, you can see that these models are warm relative to the ensemble mean, and these models have this big cold area. So that's the temperature biases, the ones that are evolving worse versus not as worse. So there's more to this analysis, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you what I think is causing it. And I think it's mixed layer depths in the Labrador Sea. You can see the bias develop in the mixed layer depths in the Labrador Sea within the first 2 months. So here again, these are the large models with the largest bias minus the mean, and here's the ones with the smallest minus the ensemble mean. And you can see these diverge by month 2. So these ones are much shallower, have a decreasing mixed layer depth compared to the ones just in the models that have the least bias. And by month 3, it's really, really clear that these 2 classes of models have very different behavior in the Labrador Sea. And so that's my guess of where things are starting off. Something is going wrong in some of the models, particularly very wrong when it comes to mixing processes, and that this is triggering this positive feedback that strengthens the subpolar gyre and ultimately ends up weakening the AMOC, and then those 2 things hold each other in space together. Okay, so for the last couple of minutes, I'm going to tell you about something else real quick, just in 5 minutes, and then I'll take some questions. Okay, so I actually designed a global climate model simulation that ended up fixing the Gulf Stream bias by up to 25%. This is still about ocean model biases, but a very different topic. So these contours are observations from ERSST, and then the shading is the improvement. So contours show a big warm bias, and the shading is the response in my climate model simulation relative to its control. Does anyone who hasn't talked with me today and know what I'm working on for my career grant want to guess what the simulation I did was? What is the one modification I did that improved this bias? Okay, I removed the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Yeah, laughing is exactly the right response. Why on earth would I ever decide to remove the Mid-Atlantic Ridge? Well, there's two serious answers. One of which is Mid-Atlantic Ridge is important for multi-decadal variability, I think, and how water masses interact with it through bottom stresses might be a key part of climate variability. So that's one of the things. But the less serious answer is no one had done it. This is the kind of simulation that, I mean, just because someone hasn't done it doesn't mean you should do it, but I think this is something we should do. In the 80s and 90s, atmospheric scientists ran this kind of simulation, global atmosphere models all the time, removing the Rocky Mountains to understand planetary waves, removing Himalaya for paleoclimate simulations. And so I figured, someone had done this, the oceanic equivalent, remove the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So I was sitting in a dentist's office looking for the paper, and I scanned about 100 or 200 papers, and I couldn't find it. There are lots of idealized simulations with Gaussian ridges, which certainly related. The dynamics of that are almost certainly related to what's going on here. But in a climate model, no one had done it. And it turns out, there's got to be something we can learn from this. So one quick result from this, I removed the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. What effects do you all think that had on the subtropical gyre? So I'll let you read that for a second. The options are strengthen, weaken, no effect, or I don't even know where to start, and we'll do a show of hands once you've had a question to think. So you remove the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, should the gyre strengthen, weaken, or not change? Okay, let's take both hands. Who thinks A, strengthen? Who thinks B, weaken? Who thinks C, no effect? Who thinks D, I don't even know where to start? Okay, so the subtropical gyre weakens in response to when the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is there. So what this is saying is the reason why our subtropical gyre has the strength it is because of flows that are supported by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, particularly up here in the Azores. So here's the control simulation. These are now barotropic stream functions, so horizontal. Here's the subpolar gyre. And you can see here's the circulation. It's a lot weaker. It's about a third weaker. And so this is all, bottom pressure torque dynamics that's going on here. And had I read some of those bottom pressure, not bottom pressure, but potential vorticity budget papers with, in hindsight, it's easy. I see in those simulations where those budgets, where this is coming from. But in retrospect, it's kind of a surprising result, right? The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is actually really important for the strength of the subpolar gyre and the subtropical gyre, because of it's just circulating. So that's the result. So how on Earth does this relate to upper ocean biases? Well, so a lot of that subtropical gyre is being supported along the Azores right here. You can even see in the difference in those stream functions. A lot of it's coming right there. If you're an equilibrated simulation, across a latitude line, you should have no net mass transport. So if you remove the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, you no longer are supporting this transport down here that's southward. So that means on the other side, you must weaken the northward transport in order to compensate once you get to equilibrium. So you're basically affecting the Gulf Stream and the deep western boundary current on this side, strengthening or weakening them in a way that is giving you SST biases that you need to remove. So this suggests that we should be looking a little bit closer at what's going on there and interrogating the models and saying, is your transports in this region reasonable, or are they too strong because of how the bathymetry files are set up? Or maybe going a little further, is there some way that we could gently massage the files in that Azores region, maybe make the slopes just a little bit shallower, in a kind of artificial way, but get an improvement on the other side of the ocean because of how those anomalies propagate from one side to the other? Maybe, but I think, we're going to try, because if all it takes is just changing a couple of, bathymetry files that are, coarsened to 1 degree on their own, maybe this is a quick way to reduce biases in an important region in a little bit. And certainly for a climate model, this isn't the most unusual thing. With 1 degree models, you have to dig out channels anyway. Like I know the guy who dug out the nearest strait channel in CSM. I mean, that's less than a degree, but it's really important for Arctic oceanography. I think this is also a case of a place where curiosity-driven science has led to something that might be much more useful for an applied problem, in this case, a model development problem. I was just wondering, well, what happens when you remove the Mid-Atlantic Ridge? Hey, it also improves this bias that's important for climate impacts. So I think, I want to put in a plea for curiosity-driven science. I feel like a lot of times there's a lot of, everyone wants to go to a use-inspired science or applied science because it'll make a difference in the world. Curiosity-driven science is important too, because it can lead to these insights that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And this certainly wasn't where I was expecting this project to go. But I think it's going to be really interesting, like, how does the bathymetry just in this one little place matter for the rest of the basin? So a couple of conclusions. Global models have a weaker AMOC, also have a lighter deep western boundary current, and they also have a North Atlantic current that's shifted to lighter classes. Cold and fresh biases are associated with a weak AMOC and a strong subpolar gyre. There's probably a positive feedback going on between these upper ocean biases, subpolar gyre, and whether you have a fresh and cold anomaly advection. Labrador sea currents, Labrador sea mixed layer depth appears to me to be the thing that's kicking it off, though I still need to double check that with a few extra diagnostics. And then finally, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge has a surprisingly big impact on climate, even far away at the western boundary. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take a couple questions.